Good day and welcome to A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. I had a couple of requests of people asking me to go through a good introduction of A Christmas Carol, things that they could expect. What about the characters? What about the themes? And so here I am ready to discuss parts of A Christmas Carol. Let's start off with some of the characters. The main character in A Christmas Carol is Ebenezer Scrooge. Now, Ebenezer Scrooge is supposed to represent the greed and selfish nature of the wealthy. We take a look at a bit of the context a little later. In Victorian England, Ebenezer Scrooge would represent the wealthy benefactors that are no longer being benefactors in society. They are trying to take their money and they're trying to use it only selfishly on themselves. Now, he resents Christmas and does the minimum for Bob Cratchit, his worker, and he refuses the charity workers any money, especially during the Christmas season. Now, as we start going through the story, we learn about Ebenezer Scrooge's past, and we find out that his fiancée left him due to his greed, and that he was a neglected child by his family and friends. Therefore, this is why he would seem to prefer to be alone. And therefore, he eventually turned his back on all of society, largely due to the fear of poverty and death. Now, in stave 5, he becomes a second father to Tiny Tim and becomes a generous, charitable, and good man. So throughout the course of the different staves, and as he is greeted by the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future, you see a turnaround of the character from his greed and selfish nature into a very generous, charitable man. At the beginning of the story, with a lot of foreshadowing, you also get the ghost of Jacob Marley. He's also going to represent greed, but he's also going to represent a penance for that greed and a penance for the sin of greed and selfishness. He also symbolizes what Scrooge will become, chained into pain for his sins of greed and wealth. Now, Jacob Marley is the first ghost that visits Ebenezer Scrooge and tells him that there will be other ghosts coming in the hopes to have Ebenezer Scrooge repent. Now, our first ghost that we see after Jacob Marley is the ghost of Christmas past. He represents the importance of childhood into adulthood. Now, the ghost of Christmas past has a light over its head, which is supposed to represent the Christmas spirit and joy. Past will also show Scrooge examples of compassion that he once had in his life and begins to show a want to be kind to people. So when we show that once upon a time, Scrooge actually had some joy in his life. Scrooge actually had love in his life. The ghost of Christmas past is hoping he'll remember that and he'll show a want or desire to continue doing that to his characters in the present tense. Now, the ghost of Christmas present is next. That is a portly, jovial man who lives only 24 hours and is introduced at a feast. The ghost of Christmas present represents charity and generosity and represents the precious nature of a Christmas time period. The ghost of Christmas present, however, also reveals ignorance and want, the children who symbolize the effect of society's treatment of the poor. These could be wild and dangerous children who will grow into wild and dangerous adults, and therefore society must change in order to treat these poor into more societal people. You also have the ghost of Christmas yet to come. Now, the ghost of Christmas yet to come represents the fear of death and takes the form of the Grim Reaper, which was an obvious symbol of death. Now, the ghost of Christmas yet to come does not speak because after death you have no voice and no power to change anything. And so he is here to show Scrooge his lonely end. At this point, Scrooge is now adamant that he should change his ways after the visiting of Jacob Marley and the other three ghosts, and he wants to change the shadows. You have other characters such as his nephew Fred and the Cratchits. They're considered more minor characters in the story. The Cratchits, for example, would be the example of the deserving poor. They're quite charitable in their own rights. They are positive and generous despite their impoverished circumstances. Now, looking at the context of the story, when we look at Victorian England in its outright, because that is where A Christmas Carol is set, our author, Charles Dickens, is also writing during this high time of society, the Victorian England age, about the 1860s, 1870s. We're going to start by looking back at when Ebenezer Scrooge would have been a young man. Starting in 1832, you have the Great Reform Bill, which gave many middle-class property owners the right to vote for the first time. And therefore, you have a larger section of the middle class and the working class and women, however, still would not have the right to vote. So even though you see reform, most of the people in Victorian England still do not have a say. In 1834, you have the Poor Law Amendment Act passed. That led to a cut in aid given to paupers to help them stay in their own homes. Because of this, workhouses were created which poor people would have to live and work in if they're unable to pay for their own housing. Now, a short time later, in September of 1843, your author, Charles Dickens, begins to visit a ragged school. Now, these would be the idea of a workhouse, except for now we have workhouses for children, and Dickens visits one of those called a ragged school. Shortly after that, in December of 1843, Dickens would write A Christmas Carol, focusing on how many of society's ills can be blamed on greed for money and status. Now, a lot of people during this time period would be quite charitable, but we would also see other people believe the opposite. Thomas Malthus, for example, believed overpopulation was the greatest threat to humanity, and eventually it would be too difficult to sustain life. Therefore, he believed it would be better without the surplus population in Victorian society, and you hear that coming from the main character, Ebenezer Scrooge. You also have several people in Victorian society, particularly the wealthy, believe that there are the idle poor. Many people believed the poor were naturally lazy and idle, and society treated them with disgust and contempt. Now, before the Poor Law, charity was the only way the poor would receive help. There were no social services in the 1840s and 1850s. You would be looking for charity from some sort of service such as a church, or you would actually have a nonprofit charity attempting to help what few poor they could in their local area. Now, there's also a reason why Charles Dickens came into this idea of writing A Christmas Carol. In 1824, Dickinson's own father is sent to jail for debt, and Dickens has to give up his education until his father inherits some money and he goes to a private school. At this time, Dickens was put to work in a warehouse pasting labels on bottles, so he had experienced poverty. When Dickens becomes an adult, he became a writer of fiction and of journalism, reporting on court cases and working for radical newspapers on his disillusionment with politics and the whole class system in Victorian England. With this context and this background of Charles Dickens, it seems quite obvious why we'd see certain themes showing up in A Christmas Carol, such as poverty, charity, fate and transformation, greed and money, family and friendship, redemption, religion, morality. So many of the different themes that you would think would go along with all this context, we could certainly find. You might also see some symbols being used as well. For example, the bells and the chains that come along with Jacob Marley and the time passing by with the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and Christmas yet to come. Where we have this time just ticking by for Ebenezer Scrooge, time seems to be running out and he has to learn his lesson. Otherwise, the chains that Jacob Marley wears will come for him as well. We also have light and fire being this sense of warmth and Christmas. And we also have the weather, a time of year for Christmas time, in which we are going to have this feeling of want and this feeling of desolation that the poor would usually feel at this time of year. So let's take a look at some of those themes. Let's start with redemption. Redemption is the idea of being saved from sin or evil. Now, in Ebenezer Scrooge, we see a man who's transformed from a greedy, selfish miser into a generous and good-natured character by the end. Now, your author, Charles Dickens, uses the ghost of Christmas present to show Scrooge how unpleasant his behavior has been. Scrooge is clearly ashamed when the ghost uses his own words against him, and he hangs his head and is overcome with penitence and grief. This self-reflection builds the foundations of Scrooge's redemption. Now, when the last ghost leaves and Scrooge finally awakes on Christmas Day, we are shown a new man. Scrooge becomes generous and full of life. He is emotionally overwhelmed with his new chance at life. The reader, just like the characters in the novella, are delighted by his transformation. Scrooge declares also that he'll live in the past, present, and the future, confirming he's grown from his experience and learned from the errors of his ways. He's able to avoid the same fate as Jacob Marley. We might also look at the theme of responsibility. Charles Dickens felt that every individual had a responsibility for those around him or her. Now we look at nephew Fred. Fred will describe Christmas as a time when men and women think of people below them as if they were really fellow passengers to the grave, and not just another race of creatures bound on other journeys. Marley's ghost will also succinctly convey the message of the novella when he cries, "Mankind was my business." This change of focus jolts us as well as Scrooge, because we learn that the proper business of life is not about seeking financial reward, but having concern for others. Scrooge also learns to take responsibility for the poor, and in doing so, he will redeem himself as good a man as the good old city knew. Ebenezer Scrooge will also show us the difference a wealthy individual can make, but Charles Dickens also shows us that Fezziwig's small contribution, the happiness he gives, is quite as great as if it cost a fortune, can also make a significant difference to an individual's life. Another one of the themes you might look at in A Christmas Carol is poverty. The Cratchits are regarded as Dickens's face of the poor in this novella. They're living on the edge as Bob Cratchit can only just afford to keep his family fed and sheltered. Tiny Tim's poor health also emphasizes the harsh realities and the consequences of living in such poverty. Now, when we look at Mrs. Cratchit's ribbons, they may be a luxury, but they're also a symbol of her desperation to make her dress look new and respectable. And therefore, she is brave in ribbons. Now, the Cratchits are grateful for their Christmas meal, although we have to wonder if this is because they don't have enough throughout the rest of the year. Nobody said or thought it was at all a small pudding for a large family. It would have been flat heresy to do so. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. Charles Dickens also shows us glimpses of poverty even deeper than that of the Cratchits. The charity collectors emphasize the desperation of the poor. They reveal that many thousands are in want of common necessaries. Many of the poor would rather die than go to the union workhouses or the treadmill. Now, Charles Dickens places Old Joe's shop in a part of the city which reeked with crime, with filth, and misery, and within this scene he shows the corrupting nature of poverty as these thieves enjoy showing what they have stolen to sell. And Scrooge is appalled by the appearance of the children, ignorance, and want. The children personify the dangerous consequences of allowing poverty to continue. Scrooge's refusal to give to charity highlights the selfishness of the higher classes and the injustice of wealth distribution in Victorian society. We can also look at the theme of education, where Charles Dickens will emphasize the value of education through his presentation of the two children, ignorance and want. First, they are horrific in their appearance. Dickens will describe them as yellow, meager, ragged, scowling, and wolfish. Now, want will serve to illustrate Dickens' belief in the power of and need for education. We're told to beware of ignorance, for he is doom. This not only refers to the uncivilized and inadequate lives the children will have as adults, but also warns readers about the blind ignorance of the rich, who do not take any responsibility for the children. The negligence of the higher classes only contributed to the suffering of the poor. Now, Charles Dickens also does not shy away from presenting the most graphic effects of ignorance and deprivation. The author makes us think about the role of education in the fight against poverty. His chilling and emotive language shows us how seriously he takes this issue. Another one of the themes would be the supernatural. A Christmas Carol is set in an ordinary location with ordinary characters. Having a convincing setting means that readers are more likely to accept an event as supernatural. It also makes the supernatural seem even stranger by contrasting it with the normal events. First of all, the narrator works hard to convince us that Scrooge's partner Marley is dead. There can be no other explanation for his reappearance other than it's his ghost that is haunting Scrooge. Now, this theme does not just refer to ghosts, because Dickens also makes use of the supernatural to manipulate time and to allow Scrooge to travel to his past, present, and future, and back again. The use of supernatural characters and events will create a unique and an interesting story. Being the first writer to associate Christmas with ghost stories enabled Dickens to give his readers a new experience. The Gothic characteristics will also help to structure the story. Each ghost will teach Scrooge an important and valuable lesson. Another one of our themes is family. Charles Dickens will balance Scrooge's isolation with vibrant vignettes that show us positive benefits of a close and loving family life. When we look at The Ghost of Christmas Past, he takes us back to the lonely young Scrooge that is rescued by his sister and returns home. We also see as an apprentice Scrooge being part of Fezziwig's Christmas party along with the countless locals that show up. And through the description of the party, Dickens emphasizes the impact that small actions can have on many people. Now, the Christmas celebrations of the Cratchits and of Fred's family show the benefits of sharing laughter and optimism during Christmas time. And also, despite their poverty, the Cratchit family are shown as the model happy family. Bob's sudden declension in high spirits when he thinks Martha can't come home for Christmas also shows us the need for families to be together at key times, such as Christmas. And the closeness of the Cratchit family having supports in them dealing with the foreshadowed death of Tiny Tim in Stave 4. Lastly, the transformed Scrooge revels in being part of his own and with part of the Cratchit family. Finally, Scrooge can feel in the last stave that he belongs somewhere. In the opposite theme of family, the sense of isolation, Charles Dickens will demonstrate the need for companionship and company. Now again, left to himself as a boy, Ebenezer Scrooge finds companionship in stories. And as an adult, Scrooge focuses on making money at the expense of personal relationships. The difference between Scrooge at the beginning of the novella and the redeemed Scrooge is considerable, and we see that it's not just due to his helping the poor. It is his result of his rejoining society as good a man as the good old city knew. Scrooge also becoming a second father to Tiny Tim means that he gets some of the love and support he has been missing or outright refusing. And of course, where else will we be with the theme but with Christmas? The story of Scrooge takes place on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day and uses the ideas of generosity and compassion that we associate with Christmas to highlight the transformation of the main character. We see Ebenezer Scrooge change from a miserly man, contrasting with the spirit of Christmas, to someone who is full of joy. The theme of the novella is clear from the title, A Christmas Carol, which refers to the traditional carols that are sung at Christmas time. The novella has an unusual layout, using 5 staves rather than chapters. Each stave has a specific purpose, and this enables Dickens to guide his readers through Scrooge's transformation. We can clearly understand how each ghost affects Scrooge, and how each lesson contributes to his final joyful redemption. By reflecting the shape of a typical carol, Dickens can present his moral tale of transformation, while also emphasizing the delight and generosity of the season. And as it does during the festive season, music has a significant presence in the novella. Music is central to a lot of the celebrations, from Fezziwig's party to the men in the solitary lighthouse. And it often provokes a powerful emotional response. Music symbolizes the joy and unity of the season, something that Scrooge eventually learns to accept and appreciate. In addition, the merry sound of the bells in Stave 5 reflects Scrooge's change and reinforces Christian values as Scrooge goes to church. Scrooge's nephew Fred also embodies the spirit of Christmas. He celebrates the season wholeheartedly and appreciates how it brings the classes together. Fred reminds the reader of the importance of compassion and forgiveness, and he refuses to give up on his uncle and welcomes him with open arms at the end of the novella. Thanks so much for stopping by to learn a little bit more about Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. If you'd like me to go through the 5 staves like chapters themselves or cover any more of the story, please let me know down in the comments what else I've missed. And as always, I'd appreciate it if you subscribed. Take care.